The courtroom went cold with laughter when Officer Travis McKenna pointed at the black woman sitting alone at the defendant's table. He told the jury, with total confidence, that she had falsified evidence and obstructed justice. The judge lifted her pen to sign the arrest order. At that exact moment, the courtroom doors swung open. More than 10 federal agents walked in without a word. The woman rose slowly from her chair and pulled a golden badge from her coat pocket. Within seconds, the officer who had just accused her understood that the case he built over 6 long months was never his. It was a trap, and he had walked straight into it from the very first day. The courtroom in the Cook County Courthouse was packed that morning, every bench filled with reporters, court clerks, and curious strangers who had followed the story for weeks through local news segments and courthouse gossip. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows, casting gray light across the polished wood floor and along the rows of waiting faces. Travis McKenna walked to the center of the room like a man who had already won, his shoes striking the floor with unhurried confidence. 14 years on, the force had taught him how to read a jury, and today he liked what he saw in their attentive, leaning postures. He laid out his evidence piece by piece, moving with theatrical precision honed by years of testimony. He held up printed photographs, then surveillance stills, then a folder of signed statements bound with a black clip. Each item landed on the table with a deliberate thud, timed for effect, punctuating his narrative like a drumbeat. He spoke of tampered records, of a woman who infiltrated a private forensics firm to plant false reports, of a scheme designed to protect criminals from justice under the guise of reform. The jury leaned forward, several of them nodding, along with the rhythm of his voice. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, aware that whatever verdict emerged would dominate the evening broadcasts. A young courtroom sketch artist worked quickly, capturing the sharp line of the woman's jaw as she sat perfectly still through every accusation. Nia Holloway wore a simple black suit, no jewelry, no visible reaction to anything said about her, her posture as composed as it had been the moment she first walked into the room. She had no lawyer beside her, no folder of her own, no notes prepared on a legal pad resting near her hands. She did not lean toward the microphone to object, did not shift in her seat when Travis raised his voice for emphasis. She did not whisper to anyone seated nearby, did not glance toward the gallery for sympathy or support. She simply watched Travis speak, her hands folded on the table, her expression unreadable to everyone in that room except, perhaps, to herself and the truth she alone understood. Whispers moved through the gallery like a current under still water, growing louder with each new exhibit Travis presented. A retired schoolteacher in the second row murmured to her neighbor that the woman looked guilty simply because she said nothing in her own defense. A young reporter typed a headline before the trial even ended, certain of how the story would close by lunchtime. The public defender assigned to sit near her offered a folder of case notes prepared the night before, but Nia only shook her head once, declining without explanation or apology. Every silence she offered seemed, to the watching room, to confirm what they had already decided to believe about her. By mid-morning, the mood inside the courtroom had hardened into something close to certainty, the earlier murmurs replaced by a settled, almost satisfied quiet. People in the hallway outside spoke of the case as though the verdict were a formality, a detail left to be signed, rather than genuinely decided. Cameras from 2 local stations waited outside the doors, their operators checking angles for the moment she would be led away in restraints. Nobody in that courtroom, from the youngest juror to the oldest bailiff standing near the door, imagined that the story had already changed direction, 6 months before that morning had even begun. A bailiff near the side entrance adjusted his stance, watching the proceedings with the practiced boredom of a man who had seen hundreds of trials blur together over the years. He did not recognize the quiet weight settling into the room, the particular stillness of a woman who had spent 12 years learning to hold her expression through far worse accusations than this one. Outside in the corridor, a vending machine hummed beneath a flickering fluorescent light, and 2 off-duty officers leaned against the wall, discussing the case in low, confident voices, certain of how the morning would end for the woman inside. Neither of them noticed the unmarked sedan idling across the street, nor the man inside it watching the courthouse entrance through a pair of dark sunglasses despite the overcast, rain-heavy sky above the city. Judge Eleanor Whitmore, 58 years old and known across the county for her exacting standards and unwavering fairness, studied the final exhibit Travis placed before her with the same careful attention she gave every document that crossed her bench. She had presided over hundreds of cases and rarely allowed herself visible reaction, yet something in the weight of the evidence made her pause longer than usual that morning. She looked toward the still, silent woman at the defendant's table, then back at the folder in her hands, searching for something she could not quite name. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying across the hushed room without needing to rise above a measured tone. The court, she said, was prepared to reach a decision before the lunch recess. Nobody in that room, least of all Travis McKenna, understood how close they stood to the edge of something none of them could yet see coming. 6 months earlier, in a windowless office on the 9th floor of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Chicago field office, a stack of complaints had grown too large to ignore any longer. Dozens of citizens, most of them from the same 3 neighborhoods on the South Side, had filed reports describing officers who altered evidence, planted charges against innocent people, and extorted small business owners under threat of false arrest. Construction companies bidding for city contracts had quietly admitted, through cautious intermediaries, that certain permits only moved forward after unmarked envelopes changed hands in back offices. No single complaint offered enough proof to indict anyone by itself. Together, however, they painted the outline of a network far too organized to be dismissed as coincidence or isolated misconduct. Special Agent Marcus Ellison, who had spent 11 years dismantling public corruption cases from Detroit to Baltimore, reviewed the growing file at 2 a.m, with a cup of coffee gone cold beside him on the desk. He circled 3 names on a whiteboard with a red marker, tapping each one twice as he spoke them aloud to the empty room. Officer Travis McKenna, veteran of the 4th District. Assistant District Attorney Victor Lang, a rising star with a spotless public record and a reputation for winning difficult cases. And an unnamed construction executive whose company had won an improbable string of city contracts over the past 3 years. The pattern suggested more than bad luck or coincidence. It suggested a system built carefully to protect itself, layer by layer, with each participant shielding the next from exposure. Marcus called a meeting the following morning and asked for one agent by name, someone he trusted more than almost anyone else in the field office. Nia Holloway had spent 12 years with the Bureau, most of them in deep cover assignments that required a patience most agents did not possess or could not sustain for long. She had worked narcotics networks in Baltimore and financial fraud rings in Miami without ever breaking character, without ever letting a single slip betray the identity she carried for months at a time. Marcus trusted her instincts more than he trusted his own read on a room, and he needed someone who could disappear completely into a new life for as long as this particular case demanded of her. Nia had grown up on the same kind of streets the complaint files described, in a neighborhood where a badge could mean protection or danger, depending on the day and the officer wearing it. She remembered her own father being stopped twice in 1 week for driving through a neighborhood he had lived in his entire life, the memory settling into her like a stone she had carried for 30 years. When she joined the Bureau at 27, colleagues had assumed she wanted the badge for the authority it carried. She had wanted it instead for the access, for the chance to stand inside rooms where decisions were made about people who looked like her family, and to make certain those decisions were made honestly for once. The assignment required Nia to vanish from her own life entirely, leaving behind every routine and relationship that might connect her to the Bureau. No contact with old colleagues, no public record tying her name to federal work, no slip that could unravel months of careful preparation. She would surface in Chicago as a private forensic consultant, a specialist brought in by a nonprofit legal aid group to review contested evidence in police misconduct cases across the city. It was slow, careful work, the kind that required her to read thousands of pages of case files while giving away nothing about who she truly was or why she had come to this particular city at this particular moment. Within weeks, her reputation inside the legal aid office grew quietly but steadily among the attorneys who worked there. She reviewed disputed cases with a precision that impressed public defenders and unsettled prosecutors who suddenly found their evidence questioned in ways they had not anticipated. She requested access to police files under the cover of her consulting role, cross-referencing timestamps, chain of custody logs, and digital metadata that most reviewers never bothered to examine closely. Marcus received her reports through a secure channel twice a week, each one adding another thread to a pattern only the Bureau could see slowly forming into a clear picture. She moved through the city like a shadow among shadows, careful never to draw more attention than her cover required. Travis McKenna had joined the force at 22, drawn less by any sense of duty than by the quiet privileges that came with the uniform in a city where connections mattered more than rules. Over 14 years he had learned exactly which sergeants would look the other way, which evidence clerks owed him favors, and which judges rarely questioned an officer's word once it was spoken under oath. He had built a small, comfortable kingdom for himself within the 4th District, one insulated by silence and mutual convenience among men who protected each other without needing to say so aloud. Nothing in his 14 years had ever truly threatened that kingdom, and he had long since stopped imagining that anything ever would. It did not take long for Travis McKenna to notice her presence in the courthouses he frequented. He had built his career on knowing exactly which people threatened his arrangements and which people could be safely ignored without consequence. A forensic consultant asking sharp questions about evidence logs from his district was not someone he could afford to ignore for long. He began asking around about her, quietly, the way a man protects something he does not want examined too closely by outsiders. Within a month, Nia Holloway had become, without knowing the exact shape of the danger yet, the single greatest threat to everything Travis McKenna had spent 14 years carefully building around himself. At first, Travis simply watched from a distance, gathering small pieces of information the way he had learned to over the years. He requested her consulting schedule from a contact inside the legal aid office, learning which courthouses she visited and on which days of the week. He drove past the building where she supposedly lived, though the address existed only as a bureau-arranged cover with no real occupant inside. He asked mutual acquaintances small, careless questions about her background, hoping someone would mention a detail that did not quite add up under scrutiny. Nia noticed the pattern almost immediately, the way a person notices a shift in weather before the first drop of rain actually falls on their skin. When watching failed to produce the answers he wanted, Travis tried a different approach entirely. He arranged an accidental meeting outside a courthouse one afternoon, offering coffee and casual conversation, testing whether flattery might loosen her guard even slightly. He mentioned, almost in passing, that a woman with her talents could make far more money working for people who valued discretion over strict adherence to rules. Nia listened without reacting, careful to keep her expression neutral, then declined politely, mindful not to close a door he might try to reopen later. She reported the conversation to Marcus that same night, word for word, understanding exactly what kind of offer had just been extended to her. Rejection did not sit well with a man who had never truly learned to accept it gracefully. Within days, Travis shifted from persuasion to fabrication, quietly building a case designed to discredit her before she could build one against him first. He requested access to surveillance footage from a courthouse hallway and had it altered by a technician owed a favor from years earlier, splicing in a timestamp that placed Nia near a locked evidence room she had never actually entered. He forged an email chain suggesting she coached witnesses to change their testimony, routing it through a server that would be difficult, though not impossible, to trace back to his own name. The forged evidence carried the polish of someone who had learned exactly how court exhibits were built and later challenged in front of a jury. Signatures were copied with careful attention to pressure and slant, mimicking handwriting samples pulled from old case files. Digital timestamps were adjusted, using software obtained through a contact in the department's technology unit. A man who asked no questions in exchange for steady favors of his own over the years. Anyone examining the surface of these documents casually would have found nothing unusual, no obvious seam, where the truth had been cut away and something false stitched carefully into its place instead. Nia recognized the fabrication almost as soon as whispers of it reached her through her network inside the legal aid office. She continued her consulting work exactly as before, reviewing files, asking questions, appearing in courthouses on her regular schedule without any visible change in behavior. Beneath her blazer, a small recording device captured every conversation that touched even indirectly on her case or Travis's growing suspicion. She began documenting Travis's movements with the same discipline she had once used to track cartel lieutenants and hedge fund fraudsters, understanding that patience, not confrontation, would ultimately win this particular fight against a man who thrived on provoking reactions. Back at the field office, Marcus reviewed Nia's latest transmission twice before forwarding it to his supervisor, aware that the operation had crossed into more dangerous territory than either of them had originally planned for. Letting a fabrication develop against one of his own agents carried enormous risk, and he knew that if anything went wrong in that courtroom, the Bureau would bear the consequences alongside her. He called Nia on a secure line late that night and asked, plainly, whether she wanted to pull out before things went further. She answered without hesitation that she intended to see exactly how far Travis McKenna was willing to go, because the answer to that question would tell them everything about who else stood behind him. Assistant District Attorney Victor Lang entered the conspiracy not through greed alone, but through a fear of exposure that had followed him for years. He had accepted favors from Travis long before this case began. Small things at first, a dropped charge here, a delayed filing there, each one seeming insignificant. until the accumulated pattern became a debt he could no longer repay, honestly or openly. When Travis approached him about the fabricated case against Nia Holloway, Victor understood immediately what was truly at stake for both of them. If she was building a case against the department, destroying her credibility in open court would destroy any case she might eventually bring alongside it. The two men met in a quiet steakhouse on a rainy Tuesday evening, choosing a corner booth away from other diners and the attentive ears of waitstaff. Victor listened as Travis laid out his plan with the confidence of a man who had never once lost in a courtroom. They agreed on the central strategy without much hesitation between them, speaking in low, careful tones. There would be no violence, no threats, loud enough to draw outside attention, nothing that might attract federal interest beyond the case itself already in motion. Instead, they would destroy her reputation so thoroughly that nothing she said afterward, to anyone, would carry any real weight in public or professional circles. If Nia Holloway was convicted, every complaint she had helped surface against corrupt officers would collapse under the shadow of her own criminal conviction. Victims who had trusted her forensic reviews would suddenly find their cases tainted by association with a woman labeled a fraud in open court. It was a strategy built entirely on the assumption that credibility, once destroyed, could never be rebuilt again, and that a courtroom victory would silence every question anyone had ever dared to raise. They filed for an expedited hearing, citing urgent public interest and mounting pressure from community groups, and the wheels of the case began turning faster than anyone outside their small circle expected or could have predicted. Travis prepared for the hearing with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for anything he had done throughout his career. He rehearsed his testimony in front of a mirror at home, adjusting his tone until it struck the balance between righteous anger and calm, measured authority. He told a colleague over drinks one evening that no one, not a public defender, not a judge, not even the woman herself, would find a way to stop what was already set firmly in motion. Confidence had carried him through 14 years of quiet corruption, without a single serious challenge, and he saw no reason it would suddenly fail him now, in this courtroom, against this particular woman. In a secure operations room 3 miles from the courthouse, Marcus Ellison watched a live feed of the courthouse entrance on a bank of monitors, saying nothing to the agents seated beside him. He had authorized Nia to let the fabricated case proceed as far as necessary to expose every person involved in the wider conspiracy. It was a decision that required nerves neither of them discussed openly, even in private conversations after hours. The evidence against Travis, Victor, and at least 2 other officers had grown thick enough to fill 3 separate federal binders stacked on his desk. Marcus had not yet given the order to move, choosing instead to wait for the one moment that would leave no room for anyone involved to claim ignorance or simple coincidence. The courtroom filled again on the morning the hearing resumed, the same reporters returning to the same benches with fresh notebooks and sharpened pencils. Travis stood before the jury and rebuilt his narrative with even greater confidence than before, adding new fabricated details meant to erase any lingering doubt among the 12 people deciding the outcome. Assistant District Attorney Victor Lang echoed every claim with the polished agreement of a man who had rehearsed his own lines just as carefully the night before. Members of the jury exchanged small nods throughout the morning, their expressions shifting slowly from doubt to something closer to firm certainty. Judge Whitmore reviewed each exhibit with visible care, entirely unaware that the documents in front of her had been constructed rather than genuinely discovered through investigation. Nia sat through the proceedings without lifting her voice once, without offering the courtroom any of the outrage everyone in the room seemed to expect from an innocent woman fighting desperately for her freedom. She did not call a single witness in her own defense, did not request a recess to consult with counsel, did not interrupt Travis, even when his claims grew more elaborate with each passing hour. Her silence unsettled some observers seated in the gallery and satisfied others completely, each reading into it whatever confirmed what they had already privately decided to believe about her guilt. Travis watched her from across the room, allowing himself the smallest, most private smile, certain that her stillness was proof of quiet defeat rather than careful, deliberate patience on her part. By early afternoon, the momentum in the room had tilted entirely against her, the earlier uncertainty replaced by something close to consensus among the watching jury. 2 jurors exchanged folded notes during a brief recess, their body language suggesting a verdict already forming clearly in their minds before deliberation had even begun. A local news anchor, watching from the gallery, texted her producer that the story appeared headed toward the ending. Everyone in the newsroom already expected to broadcast that evening. Travis leaned back in his chair, with the ease of a man who had already collected his victory in his mind, glancing occasionally toward Victor, with the quiet satisfaction of shared, imminent success. Neither man noticed the small, steady rhythm with which Nia checked the clock mounted above the courtroom doors, counting something only she understood. A young public defender, watching from the gallery, leaned toward a colleague and whispered that she had never seen a defendant so calm in the face of near-certain conviction, wondering aloud whether calm was simply what surrender looked like for some people. Victor Lang allowed himself a rare glance at his phone beneath the table, a single text message from an unlisted number confirming that the construction executive's payment had cleared without incident earlier that morning. Travis straightened his tie, feeling for the first time in weeks the full, satisfying weight of a plan executed exactly as intended from the very beginning. None of them noticed the slight shift in Nia's breathing, the almost imperceptible way her shoulders settled, the posture of someone no longer waiting, but finally, quietly, ready. Judge Whitmore turned to the defendant's table as the afternoon light dimmed behind the tall windows, offering the customary final question before sending the jury toward deliberation. She asked whether the defendant had anything further to say before the court proceeded to its next step. Nia rose slowly, buttoning her jacket with unhurried precision, and answered in a voice too calm for the enormous weight of what was coming next. She told the judge she needed only 30 seconds, nothing more. The judge, mildly surprised by the strange specificity of the request, glanced briefly at her watch, and granted it without objection or further question. Nia's eyes moved briefly toward the tall windows, lining the western wall of the courtroom, where rain streaked the glass in thin silver lines, catching the gray afternoon light. Outside, on the street below, a line of black federal vehicles turned the corner in tight, practice formation, their tires cutting through standing water without slowing for a single moment. Agents in tactical vests stepped out in disciplined silence, moving toward the courthouse entrance with the coordinated calm of people who had rehearsed this exact sequence many times before this day. None of it was visible from inside the courtroom itself, yet Nia's expression carried the quiet certainty of someone counting down a number only she could see clearly in her mind. An elevator near the courthouse's east corridor opened on the ground floor, and a group of federal agents stepped out in tight formation, their badges already visible against their chests. Court security officers near the entrance exchanged confused glances, unsure whether to intervene or simply step respectfully aside. A clerk near the stairwell froze mid-step, phone in hand, uncertain whether to call for backup or simply watch the scene unfold before her. Inside the courtroom itself, no one yet understood what was unfolding, just beyond the heavy wooden doors, separating them from the hallway. Judge Whitmore glanced once more at her watch, noting that Nia's requested 30 seconds had very nearly expired. The courtroom doors swung open with a force that silenced every whispered conversation in the gallery instantly and completely. Special Agent Marcus Ellison walked through first, his expression calm in the manner of someone who had waited many months for this exact moment to finally arrive. Behind him, a dozen federal agents filed into the room, spreading along the back wall with quiet, practiced discipline honed through years of coordinated operations. Nia rose fully from her seat at the defendant's table, unhurried, and reached into the inner pocket of her blazer, without any trace of hesitation. She placed a golden badge on the table in front of her, the metal catching the fluorescent light overhead, followed by a folded federal warrant that struck the wood with a soft, final sound that seemed to echo across the silent room. Marcus stepped forward and addressed the room in a voice that carried without ever needing to be raised above a measured, deliberate tone. He announced that Special Agent Nia Holloway had been operating undercover for the past 6 months on behalf of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Unit. The words landed across the courtroom like a sudden drop in air pressure, and for several long seconds, no one in the room moved at all. Judge Whitmore's pen, still poised above the paperwork in front of her, hovered without touching the page beneath it. Victor Lang's face drained of color so completely that the court reporter later described him as looking like a man, watching his own funeral unfold, in slow, unbearable, real time. Travis McKenna sat frozen in his chair, his mouth opening slightly as though searching desperately for words that refused to arrive at all. 14 years of confidence collapsed in the space of a single sentence, leaving him staring at the badge on the table as though it might somehow disappear if he simply looked at it long enough. The jury members glanced at one another, their earlier certainty replaced entirely by a confusion none of them had prepared for that morning. Somewhere near the back of the room, a reporter's pen slipped from her fingers and clattered against the wooden floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the stunned, absolute silence that followed his announcement. At Marcus's signal, 2 agents wheeled a portable display screen to the front of the courtroom and connected it swiftly to a secure laptop resting on a nearby cart. The first file that appeared showed footage from a hidden camera Nia had worn during her meetings with Travis, capturing his voice with perfect clarity as he offered her money in exchange for her silence. The second file displayed audio recordings of Travis and Victor discussing the fabricated hallway footage in explicit, damning detail that left little room for interpretation. Bank records followed, showing transfers from a construction company's account into accounts linked to both men, disguised carefully as consulting fees for services that never actually existed. Encrypted messages, decoded patiently by bureau technicians over recent weeks, appeared next on the screen, revealing conversations that had planned the entire courtroom strategy from its earliest, most calculated stages. Judge Whitmore studied each exhibit with an expression that shifted slowly from disbelief to controlled, simmering fury as the pieces assembled themselves before her eyes. She realized, with mounting clarity, that every document Travis had presented as evidence that same morning had been altered, forged, or entirely fabricated for the singular purpose of destroying an innocent woman's reputation. The hallway footage bore digital artifacts, consistent with splicing software, details a careful forensic review would have caught immediately under proper scrutiny. The signatures on witness statements showed inconsistencies in pressure and stroke that no genuine document would ever contain if examined closely. Victor Lang's name appeared repeatedly throughout the recovered files, tying him directly to conversations he had denied under oath only hours earlier that same day. A final recording played through the courtroom speakers, capturing Travis's own voice from 3 weeks earlier, boasting to Victor that no forensic consultant, however sharp, could ever outmaneuver a system built by men who controlled every piece of paper that entered a courthouse. The irony of those words, played back to the very room he had hoped to control completely, settled over the gallery like a second, heavier silence. Judge Whitmore listened to the recording twice, her jaw tightening with each repetition, before setting the laptop aside and turning her full attention back to the man who had spoken those words with such certainty. Travis stared at the screen as though it belonged to someone else's trial entirely, unable to reconcile the confident voice on the recording with the stunned silence now closing in around him. 2 additional officers from Travis's district appeared by name in the recovered communications, their involvement in evidence tampering and extortion laid out clearly across multiple recordings and financial records spanning several years. A construction executive, previously unnamed in any public reporting on the case, was identified as the source of payments routed through shell accounts to protect several ongoing city contracts from scrutiny. The full scope of the conspiracy stretched further than even some of the agents present in the room had anticipated when the investigation first began 6 months earlier. Reporters in the gallery typed furiously on their phones and laptops, aware they were witnessing a story far larger than the one they had arrived that morning expecting to cover. The courtroom, moments earlier, filled with confident murmurs and quiet certainty, had fallen into a silence heavy enough to feel almost physical against the skin. Judge Whitmore set down her pen and addressed the room with the steady authority she had built carefully over decades spent on the bench. She signed new orders, not for the woman who had sat silently through hours of false accusations directed at her, but for the men who had constructed those accusations in the first place. Federal agents moved forward without hesitation, first toward Travis McKenna, then toward Victor Lang, then toward the 2 additional officers named clearly in the recovered files. A 5th order was issued for the construction executive to be served at his downtown office within the following hour by a separate team already in position. The courtroom, which had spent the entire morning ready to condemn an innocent woman without question, now watched the true architects of the conspiracy finally face the consequences they had spent years successfully avoiding. Travis rose from his chair as an agent approached with handcuffs, his earlier composure completely gone, replaced by something close to genuine panic in his eyes. He looked toward Nia, searching her face for some explanation, some small sign of the exact moment he had missed entirely. In a voice stripped of all its earlier confidence and swagger, he asked her how long she had known, how long she had watched him build a case meant to destroy her from the very beginning. Nia met his gaze without flinching, her voice calm, and even as she finally answered him directly, she told him it had been from the very day he decided a black woman sitting quietly in a courtroom would be easy to blame for something she never did. The handcuffs closed around Travis McKenna's wrists, in full view of the very reporters he had once hoped would celebrate his victory that evening. Camera shutters clicked rapidly from the gallery, capturing the exact moment his career and his freedom ended simultaneously and completely. Victor Lang was led out through a side door moments later, his earlier polish replaced entirely by the hollow expression of a man calculating just how many years he might now lose. The 2 additional officers were escorted out separately from one another, each one carefully avoiding eye contact with colleagues who had once trusted them completely without question. Outside, rain continued to fall steadily over the courthouse steps, entirely indifferent to the collapse unfolding within the walls above. In the months that followed, the city of Chicago undertook one of the largest police reform efforts in its recent history, driven directly by the evidence Nia Holloway had gathered during her lengthy undercover assignment. Dozens of wrongful conviction cases were reopened for careful review, many of them tied directly to evidence tampering by officers connected to Travis McKenna's wider network of corruption. Several individuals who had spent years behind bars based on fabricated charges were finally released, their names cleared through hearings that drew far less public attention than the original scandal that had exposed the entire scheme. Judge Eleanor Whitmore issued a rare public statement acknowledging how close the court had come to convicting an innocent woman based on evidence she had trusted without sufficient scrutiny at the time. Her words carried the weight of someone who understood exactly how fragile justice could truly be when confidence replaced careful, patient examination of the facts. A city council hearing convened 3 weeks after the trial's collapse, drawing testimony from community members who had spent years filing complaints that seemed to disappear into silence without any real response. One woman described watching her son, arrested on evidence she always suspected was falsified, evidence now confirmed as part of the same network Travis McKenna had helped build over more than a decade. The city's police superintendent, standing before cameras he could no longer avoid, announced a full audit of evidence handling procedures across every district in Chicago. It was a small, procedural step, but for families who had waited years to be believed, it represented something closer to vindication than they had ever expected to see in their lifetimes. Special Agent Marcus Ellison commended Nia Holloway before the full Chicago field office, in a ceremony marked by quiet respect rather than public spectacle. Colleagues who had worked alongside her for years learned, many of them for the very first time, the full extent of what she had endured during those 6 long months undercover. The story spread far beyond Chicago. Within days, picked up by national outlets drawn to the sharp reversal at the heart of it, a woman accused in the morning and vindicated by the same afternoon. Legal analysts debated the case on evening broadcasts, some praising the operation's patience, others questioning whether the Bureau had let the fabricated charges run dangerously close to an actual conviction. Editorial writers pointed to the case as proof of how easily a courtroom could be turned into a weapon against exactly the kind of person it was meant to protect. Through all of it, the woman at the center of the story remained almost entirely absent from the coverage, a deliberate silence that only seemed to deepen the public's fascination with who she truly was. Reporters who had once written headlines assuming her guilt now sought interviews to tell the fuller, more complicated story of what had actually happened behind the scenes. Nia declined every single request, without exception, offering no statements, no photographs, no public account of her own experience during the operation. She returned to her work within the Public Corruption Unit within days of the trial's collapse, choosing quiet continuation over public recognition or celebrity. A younger agent, newly assigned to the unit that same year, approached Nia one afternoon in the break room with a question she had clearly been holding on to for some time. She asked why Nia had allowed the trial to proceed so far, why she had not simply revealed her identity the moment Travis first began fabricating evidence against her. Nia considered the question for a long moment, then answered with the same quiet composure she had carried throughout the entire operation from its earliest days. She explained that revealing herself too early would have given every guilty man in that courtroom a chance to talk his way free of consequence. Silence, held long enough and with enough patience, she said, was sometimes the only way to let liars finish writing their own confession without realizing what they had done. Marcus, passing by the break room doorway, paused long enough to add one final thought before continuing down the hallway toward his office. He told the younger agent that the most dangerous mistake anyone in their line of work could make was assuming a quiet person had nothing left to say. Travis McKenna had made that exact mistake the first time he looked at Nia Holloway, and decided, without any real evidence, exactly who she was and what she was capable of. It was a mistake that cost him his badge, his freedom, and every certainty he had ever carried about the world working in his favor. The younger agent nodded slowly, turning the words over carefully in her mind, as though committing them to memory for a future she could not yet fully imagine for herself. Outside the window of the Chicago field office, rain continued to fall in the same steady rhythm that had marked the city since the day the investigation first began 6 months earlier. Somewhere across town, the courthouse steps sat empty in the gray afternoon light, water pooling gently along the stone edges, where reporters and cameras had once gathered in anticipation of a very different ending. Nia finished her coffee, closed the file resting open in front of her, and returned to the quiet work that had defined her entire career for 12 years now. Justice, she had learned long ago through hard experience, rarely announced itself loudly or all at once. Down in the lobby of the field office, a security guard nodded to her as she passed. The same nod he gave every evening without knowing anything about the case that had made headlines across the country weeks earlier. She stepped out into the cool evening air, where the rain had finally softened into a light mist, drifting beneath the streetlights along the avenue. Somewhere behind her, inside the building, files were already being prepared for the next investigation. Another set of complaints, waiting for someone patient enough to see them through to the end. Nia pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the train station, unremarkable to every stranger who passed her on the sidewalk, exactly as she preferred to remain. Most often, it simply waited, patient and unseen, exactly as Nia herself had waited, until the truth finally had nowhere left to hide from the people who had tried so carefully to bury it.